Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this year's conference. I hope you enjoyed your short break. I want to welcome you to the Concurrent Session 1.2, which is going to be speaking about building up digital citizenship and media and information literacy. We've heard a lot so far about some of the principles underpinning media and information literacy in the digital age, the challenges it presents, the opportunities it presents. And I think now we are going to get a chance to get a sense of what digital citizenship can really look like and what it means to people through some of our brilliant speakers who are about to join us. In this session, we have Cecilia Barbieri, who's the Chief of Section for Global Citizenship and Peace Education at the Division for Peace and Sustainable Development and the Education Sector at UNESCO. Cecilia will be leaving us after she presents. She's very busy. So unfortunately, we will not be able to field any questions to Cecilia after her, but I'm sure we will still get a lot of value out of her presentation. We are also joined by Josephat Chio, who is the Acting Director of the Millie Trust in Namibia. And I'm from Southern Africa too, so I am very excited to hear about what's been happening on the ground there. And we're also joined by Bushra Abadi, who's the social innovator and the co-founder of the Hyla Initiative. And these three speakers will each bring their unique perspectives and experience to this topic. We will start with the presentations, which will be 20 minutes each, and I ask the speakers to please try and stick to this. Everything has gone over today because there's so much to say on these topics, and I will give you a warning if you are getting close to your time. And then we encourage the audiences to please, as our speakers are speaking, any thoughts that come to mind, any questions you may have, please put your questions and comments into the chat box, which you can use throughout the sessions, and we will then address those after the presentations. And then I will also moderate a discussion afterwards as issues come up. But I do encourage audiences to please to be involved, to ask your questions. It's a unique opportunity to really get some insight from people with real experience in these areas. So we will start with Cecilia's presentation. And she'll be speaking about GCED in the digital age, as well as introducing some of UNESCO's work on digital citizenship, including teacher guidelines. And it's very exciting for me personally, because I've been here in Seoul, outside of this conference, also working on sort of guidebooks for teachers around MIL and what it could mean for young people. So I think with no further ado, I think we're going to go straight to Cecilia as we can. Cecilia, are you ready for us?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Okay, perfectly well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. And I'm very pleased actually to have the opportunity to join you in this session. And I sincerely apologize because I cannot stay longer. But any question, in case you can take it, and I will respond later to whoever will share it with us. So, you know, this is a very, I would say, timely and important and essential topic, the topic of global citizenship education in a digital age. So, and, you know, let me start by considering that while the world's technology advanced and made it possible, for example, for, you know, fora such as this one we are today to take place, we also can see inadvertent consequences that have led to an increase in hate speech, in a rise in disinformation, polarization of online society, a creation of echo chambers for like-minded individual. And just to, you know, just to give the sense of the situation, just in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, and the US alone, its speech had risen by 20% since the outbreak of COVID-19, of the pandemic. In Germany, researchers identified connections between increases in anti-refugee Facebook posts and uptick in related hate crimes. In 2020, Twitter removed more than 1,600,000 pieces of content that were deemed to violate Twitter's hate speech policy. And additionally, YouTube removed about plus than 80,000 videos within a 3-month span in 2021 only that violated YouTube's hate speech policy, just to say a few. And these figures actually underscore the importance of directing our attention and our efforts towards programs and activities that works and policies that work to address this very real problem. So in the context of our work, this really requires utilizing the power of education to focus on fostering what we call global digital citizens. And digital citizenship refers actually to the ability of individuals, of all of us, to first of all find, to access, to use, and to create information effectively, to engage with other users and with content in an active, in a critical, in a sensitive, and in an ethical manner. It requires to navigate the online and ICT environment safely and responsibly, and it requires to be aware of one's own rights and of others' rights. So one of the building blocks to create digital citizens is media information literacy. I think we already heard some session earlier focusing on that. We know MIL focuses on the essential competencies, essential knowledge, and essential skills and essential attitudes that allow citizens to engage with the content online and offline as well effectively. So to develop critical thinking and lifelong learning skills for socializing and for becoming active and responsible citizens. And in order for individuals to obtain the values and the abilities to contribute to what we consider a more just and inclusive world, both online and offline, is necessary for them to understand their important role as digital citizens. This will allow them to obtain awareness and to obtain intelligence, to be proactive in society while protecting themselves and others also from negative consequences. And just to mention a little bit what the work that UNESCO has been undertaking more recently, I would say, in order to raise awareness also of the darker components of the digital world by creating, we say, programs, initiatives, and guidelines that can equip educators and learners with the tools that are necessary to be prepared and be able to adapt and to respond, to react to various situations. So you can just see, I think, on the screen a few of the highlights I will just bring us through. And let me start with something that for us is a normative instrument, and that is, they say, the basis for a lot of the work that UNESCO and the countries actually can do to address the issue of digital citizenship. We are currently working on the revision of a recommendation that was adopted in 1974, and this is a recommendation that concerns education for international understanding, cooperation and peace, and education relating to human rights and fundamental freedoms. It's a long title, very rich and very dense in content. And the purpose of this revision is actually to ensure that this recommendation, that is still such a landmark instrument, but after so many years, it is relevant and is responding to the current issues of our time, to have it more interdisciplinary, to have it as an holistic approach to learning, and to ensure that it addresses all levels and all forms of education, so formal, non-formal, and informal. And this recommendation, as you recall, 74, we didn't have all the digital environment that we are living in right now. At the time, it was more media, TV and radio. But with this revision, the recommendation also encourage digital skills that empower learners to critically evaluate, to ethically produce, to responsibly disseminate information, and to have the ability to recognize and respond to disinformation and online harmful content, in order to ensure universal and diversified access to information, to materials, and to resources. Then we had a recent paper produced to inform exactly the issue of digital learning when it comes to the revision of the recommendation. And some of the key highlights in this reflection that we produced is that if students are to actively and responsibly engage in digital communities and in movements that seek to address global challenges, it is necessary to integrate digital literacy and global citizenship abilities and capacities, or capabilities, I would say. Education presents opportunity to frame the mastery of digital tools around broader values of international understanding, of human rights, of equality, and of social justice. And the second point that I would like to highlight is that digital literacy entails appropriate uses of what are digital tools, digital communication, digital identities, digital rights, digital health, and digital safety and security. And finally, that these digital capacities need to be complemented by the cognitive, socio-emotional, and behavioral dimensions of global citizenship education. To move on, we also have recently published a report for teachers on addressing conspiracy theories through education, which is an area linking the two, which is quite new in terms also of studying and understanding how to address this type of issues. And one critical point that is included in this advocacy tool actually is that is to help educators and learners distinguish between real conspiracy and conspiracy theories, and to identify red flags when it comes to conspiracy theory. And a second point is the importance of providing practical advice through this tool for when and how to have conversations with learners who believe in conspiracy theory. I think educators are now facing that, and they really, I think, often can be not prepared themselves to respond to that. And finally, the purpose is to help teachers create classrooms that are conducive to respectful dialogue, to open discussion, and to critical thinking. And this links actually to the broader work that we are undertaking with a lot of partners and with countries on addressing hate speech through education. We had a global ministerial meeting. Ministers of education were gathered last year to look at this issue and on the role of education. What does it mean for education to address actually hate speech? And so we are actually working on specific initiative that focus on designing and implementing policies to develop key digital citizen skill, to address a speech through cross-cultural intervention, and to enhance actually multi-sector cooperation by building the partnership with all relevant stakeholders. Education, we know, doesn't exist in a vacuum, and especially when it comes to the issue of hate speech and online presence, there are a lot of key partners, particularly considering, for example, social media and others that have an important role to play. I believe you have already heard by a colleague earlier on a recently published media information literacy curriculum for teachers that looks in particularly and address the intricate nature of media and information literacy and how teachers can be empowered to include it in their classroom learning. And I believe also Joseph later will also look at this issue. So let me just go more specifically on this latest tool that we have just finalized right now, and is an upcoming guidelines that we are currently developing on global citizenship education in the digital age. And this document actually takes into consideration how children and young people have been growing in an era of digital transformation and the importance for them to understand the rights and the responsibility in the online world. And this let's say we want to reiterate and stress, brings to the forefront the importance of why global citizenship matters in a digital age. We want our citizens of the present and of the future to be able to interact with others ethically and responsibly, as I already mentioned, which I think is very critical, these two important values in an online format. Therefore, also our educators have a responsibility to ensure that technologies are utilized in a manner that safeguards the human rights, the freedom of expression, and the access to information for all students. And these guidelines are a culmination, I can say, of all the work that I mentioned previously, and they incorporate principle of global citizenship education, of digital citizenship, and of media and information literacy to build critical thinking skills about the online and the physical influences and content that the students encounter and engage with. And additionally, the guidelines also aim to build an understanding of global challenges and how learners can contribute to the sustainable development goals through globally oriented digital citizenship. And this, just to give an example, this is a chart developed in these teacher guidelines on key global citizenship competencies in a digital age. And this is what you see is actually grounded in the GCED competencies that enable learners to act collaboratively and responsibly on issues of local and of global relevance. So overall, the goal of citizenship competencies in a digital age are aimed to stimulate learners to better understand themselves, to better understand others, to see connections between global and local issues, to gather multiple perspectives, and to prepare them to be socially and ethically active members of a community that is actually a universal community. So the integration of media and information literacy and digital citizenship into global citizenship includes understanding the impact of digital technologies that digital technologies have on one's life, and the ability to use media creatively and innovatively to engage in person, but also virtually with local and global communities. And these teacher guidelines also include the learning modules that suggest activities in each of the areas identified as key global citizenship competencies in a digital age. And this is just to give some example. One of the benefits of this module is that they could be integrated into different learning environments. It could be classroom, it could be hybrid, it could be formal or informal learning environment. And for example, one of the activities from the module that focuses on the Sustainable Development Goal 16, that you know is on peace, justice, and strong institution, is to ask learners to reflect on questions related to social media and the limit of freedom of expression. And this includes having learners question, for example, statements that they see online. Additionally, examining the role of the individual, of the community, and of larger society to respond and prevent violence online. Another example, my last example, of an activities from a module, for us it will be a module 4, that focuses in particularly on the SDG number 5, on gender equality. And the activity, for example, is a discussion with learners to explore being socially responsible online and asking them to reflect on example of online discrimination, thinking about why discrimination takes place online, becoming aware of the support and of the resources available to turn also for help in case of violence and of bullying, for example, cyberbullying. So I think, you know, this was just to see from these few examples, the modules are quite extensive and they cover a wide variety of topics. And the purpose is really to serve as concrete resource that teachers could easily turn to and integrate into their learning environment. Now, finally, this is just a link that I will leave for a set of resources that I just discussed and that are all available online. So just to close, I just would like once again to stress on the importance of fostering what we call digital citizens. We are all digital citizens now in today's age, and given the fact that current learners and young people are growing up as technology is rapidly advancing as well. So our educators are really faced with a complicated task of adapting education and updating education in the classroom to keep up. So we hope actually that with some of this work we can really provide support and awareness for the broad community of educators and also learners as they navigate different type of environments. So I would like to leave it to end here, and all questions are welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for your presentation. It's really great to see, after so much speak already over the past few sessions around media and information literacy, really as a response to content, that something is really focusing on active participation as well, and reminding everyone that sort of our engagement with the digital world is very much a two-way street. We aren't just consumers of content, we have responsibilities as well as people who live in a digital space. So thank you so much, and good luck for your very busy day. I know you need to dash now. After Cecilia's brilliant presentation, we are now moving to Joseph Hatt, who is the Acting Director at the Millie Trust in Namibia. He will be speaking about his youth inclusion in media and information literacy project in Namibia. And it's an exciting example of media and information literacy education in action. So I would be very keen to see what happened in our part of the world. So Joseph Hatt, please take it away when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And as I've been introduced, my name is Joseph Achion. I'm the Acting Director for Millie Trust. So in my presentation, what I'm going to touch on is that I'm going to touch on basically on what we do at Millie here in Namibia, and also how that helps to, to groom and also to capacitate young people in Namibia. Our main focus is actually young people between the ages of 18 to 35, and those are the people that we try to really capacitate. Why do we believe in information or media and information literacy? Is the fact of that, the world is moving, and we're having more and more people growing, or the population is increasing actually, where it's estimated to reach about 8 billion population by November. And specifically for us in a small country as Namibia, we have a population of about 2.6 million for the whole country. And out of that population, more and more of the population are actually young people. And that is why we believe that in the importance of media and information literacy, and especially COVID-19 has also taught us specifically in Namibia on why media and information literacy is quite important, especially because there has been a lot of information around disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. And this has also really taught us on the importance of why we need to really advocate and raise awareness on the importance of media and information literacy. I was quite, intrigued by the presentation by Ms. Cecilia, because she touched on a lot of things around what UNESCO is doing, because also for us here at Millie, we do engage with UNESCO, the Windhoek branch, and we have hosted different similar activities and initiatives around media and information literacy, especially the curriculum that she touched on the curriculum for educators and learners also. And also the whole workshop that we had with UNESCO was on MIL Clicks, where we were training young people also on the importance of media and information literacy online now. And then they became multipliers of information disseminations. Particularly, we also believe that media and information literacy is quite vast, and it can be used in any sectors. It can be used in any cross-sectoral aspect. And also one of the things that we have used here at Millie was that we engaged with different stakeholders, and we also came up with a drill book where we incorporated media and information literacy in sports. How do tennis players, know about media and information literacy? How do soccer players, know the importance of media and information literacy, but then incorporating it in their daily activities? So we incorporated games and energizers that led to topical discussions around media and information literacy. But then particularly, we also found out that, we will not be able to really make much of an impact if we do not really address the importance of media and information literacy, especially in the education curriculum. And that is why we have now also worked on incorporating media and information literacy by educating the educators or the teachers through our National Institution for Education Development, so that then these components will also be incorporated in the school curriculum as well as also the school syllabus. But then the approach that we also touched on in my presentation here was that, it's quite crucial and it's quite important that we try to address this as a holistic approach, or in a holistic approach, in terms of not working in silos. And against that, in our country or in Namibia, we have been actually engaging with different institutions and stakeholders, such as the Deutsche Welle Academy, as well as also our government ministry, because this is one of the ways that we have been tackling the information around media and information literacy in Namibia, and also try to make sure that we are not working in silos, but that we are creating an impact to our beneficiaries, and that we are also creating an impact to the stakeholders that are there. Because if you are not creating impact, then you are not really doing much of an effort. Because of my limited time, so I'll just be touching bits and bits on some of my presentation here, and then leave more floor for question and answers. So at Millie, one of the most, our approach is that, we believe in learning by experience, and also because of our young people that we work with. And then we also believe in peer-to-peer learning, because we believe that, we are not all experts, and we also classify ourselves as facilitators, because we are there to facilitate discussion and engagement on media and information literacy, so that we learn together and also be able to learn from each other, and together we address the issues that we're trying to work around. But then how do we do this? Media and information literacy is quite broad. There are different elements around it. And for us, what we really try to do is that we incorporated different manuals and curriculums that really are youth-centered, and that addresses the issues around media and information literacy in the country. Because at Namibia, there has been actually a lot of information overload, and also a lot of disinformation here and there. And then mostly, and what we've also found out was that, most of this information are information that are also spread by our young people, the people that we think, or that we believed, that they are exposed to digital, they have all the smartphone, they have, internet accessibilities and all of this. But then why do we spread misinformation, or why do we spread fake news and all of that? So in our manuals, we have both the manuals that we call the traditional manuals, where we train them on, the basic media literacy. And then we also have the social media one, using the approach also more or less a little bit like what Ms. Cecilia was talking about with UNESCO on access and analyze. But in Millie, we have what we call the 5 dimensions, and these are what we call the Accra. So it's not the capital city of Ghana, but it's Accra, which stands for, access. Is that young people first need to access information, and then you need to analyze the information. You need to create now those information, or your own perception of what you found out from those information. And then most importantly, you need to reflect on this information before you act. So this is the approach that we try and use, and this is the approach that we use at Millie also to train and capacitate young people. And we have also tried and piloted this project in other 5 different countries also, which I will touch on briefly around that. But then what has actually been very much practical and very much user-friendly for us was that we clustered this media and information literacy into 3 different components, or 3 different activities that we engage with our young people here. And that the first one is the summer school, which is a 10 days intensive training, where we invite young people from all over the world, not all over the world, sorry, but from all over Namibia, to come together and have an 10 days intensive training on media and information literacy in terms of media ethic. Why is it important? Why do young people need to do this? And then from these 10 days, they then go back into their respective constituencies and regions, and they become multipliers through our projects that we call the youth projects. And this also tells you, or it teaches us a lot of different things that, first of all, is that you're not working in silos. Secondly, is that you are capacitating young people on important information around media and information literacy. And thirdly, is that you are creating a pool of multipliers who can then be able to go back into their respective regions and make sure that more and more young people are capacitated on media and information literacy. But then because this is not something that can be done in 3 days or in 10 days, so we also have another more certificate course where we now train the facilitators now to become trainers, and tackling or touching on different components or modules that we have them here. So as I've mentioned also in terms of like not working in silos, so we've also piloted the MILI Goes Africa or the MIL Goes Africa, where we reached 5 different countries, which is Burkina Faso, Ghana, Uganda, Ivory Coast, and Lesotho, to really try and see what are the synergies between the countries, how can we leverage on each other when it comes to media and information literacy, what are the policy issues around media and information literacy, what can we do together, you know, as collective, as a continent, as a country, to really try and address the importance of media and information literacy. And this was also done over a pool of like 2 months, and we had about 12 trainers from our country who really went to these 5 different countries and capacitated about 80 participants in 2 languages, which is of course the Anglophone and the Francophone, because some of the countries are Francophone countries. So one of the most important things that we've also learned is that, you know, we need to address the issues of media and information literacy as collective. And then we also needed to realize that, you know, media and information literacy is cross-cultural. We need to understand it most importantly into our landscape. How does that speak to our landscape? How do we understand it into our own landscape, into our own vernacular, into our own context also as countries? Because the way that we might be having some challenges around MIL might not be the way that some other countries might also be facing that issue. Some countries might be already advanced, and some countries might be at the beginner stage. And this is why we really try to make sure that young people are really capacitated, and that we try to do the basic, and then from the basic we grow up into a more holistic approach also in addressing this information of media and information literacy also. And then maybe lastly also just to touch on was that one of the things that we've also incorporated in MILI is that we have currently engaging with Wikipedia, where we are also now, because they have also an educational component around media and information literacy, where they have an online, about a 3 months online training, which is a trainer of trainers on media and information literacy, you know, especially for educators and for teachers also, on how this can be also be able to be incorporated on this component. So I think in a nutshell, what I wanted to really share in my presentation was really in terms of how we at MILI try to raise awareness and address the issues of media and information literacy, and how we can then be able to leverage and create synergies with what other stakeholders are also working on this or around these issues. And then together, then we can also be able to address the matters moving forward. So I'm more than willing to engage further on any other questions or any other particular issues that the participant or the audience would like me to deliberate more on or engage more on. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Josephat, for that. That's really fascinating to see young people really engaging with the sort of theory that we've been speaking about for the past few days. And I'm sure we'll have questions for you after the next presentation as well. So our next presenter is, Bushra Abadi, who's the social innovator and the co-founder of the Hyla Alliance. And Bushra will be speaking about the importance of narratives and intersectional, global, and international and intergenerational approaches to decolonizing the digital space. And again, that's also another topic which is very, you know, as coming from the Global South, a super important take on these things that we've been speaking about theoretically so far. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, Bushra, when you're ready.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I first want to begin by positioning myself. So I'm a first-generation Afghan Canadian, and I am currently joining you today from the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I will just move to the next slide. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples have inhabited and cared for this land. And in particular, I want to acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabeg, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land, and by doing so give my respect to its first inhabitants. But perhaps more importantly, it is vital for me to move beyond land acknowledgements, which have in many cases and contexts become performative displays of solidarity with Indigenous communities in the absence of material and structural change and reparations. And I commit myself to implementing the truth and reconciliation calls to action within what we currently call Canada, and to center community and meaningful relationships in the ways I engage, partner, and coexist with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And I encourage everyone joining us today to take time to learn about and meaningfully support movements for liberation, justice, and self-determination in each of your respective communities. So I'm going to start with framing this around stories. Much of my presentation is going to focus on power and narratives and the role of media in information literacy, as well as education and decolonizing digital spaces, which I find to be a critical key issue as we move forward collectively in the pursuit of peace and justice. So this story that I'm focusing in on is a story that is emerging in many contexts around the world, and there's this global converging crises that we're facing. So we've seen this with the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as other health crises, the climate crises that we're facing, increased displacement globally as a result of conflict and humanitarian and natural disasters, as well as political violence that various communities around the world are experiencing. And much of these crises, we're also finding that women and girls' bodies and persons have become a battleground for our collective struggle for justice in both digital and physical spaces. But oftentimes, when we talk about women and girls' struggles or the struggles of queer or gender and sexually diverse persons, it is not those people or those marginalized communities who are telling the story. So it's really critical for us to ask this question: who is telling the story and who has access to these spaces, both digital and offline? And I think it's really key for us to be thinking about these things moving forward, because even when we consider the concepts of citizenship, what might seem to be something that is inclusive is in fact a barrier for various people, especially people who lack official citizenship in various contexts, including stateless, displaced, and precarious migrants. This is a really important consideration for us to make, because as we know, language is a very powerful tool in how we understand each other and how we frame our interactions and relationships with one another. So in the work that I do, to decolonize spaces or to look at some of these issues through a critical lens and advance peace, justice, and the agency of systematically marginalized communities, I use this integrated approach, which combines global, intersectional, intergenerational ways of being, seeing, and relating. So when I talk about global, what I mean is not just geographically global, but also working across sectors, disciplines, and thinking about things through this holistic systems approach. Intersectionality, I'm going to just provide like a brief overview of this concept. It is really looking at the layers and complexity of inequality experienced by individuals and groups with multiple identities. And the term first emerged in 1989 when Kimberly Crenshaw, an African-American feminist legal scholar and civil rights activist, coined the term through some of the research that she had published. This is a theoretical framework used to understand how inequality can be experienced by an individual on the basis of their gender, race, religion, class, sexual orientation, nationality, citizenship status, disability, or age. And then on top of that, also including intergenerational. Within this context of the digital age in particular, we're seeing that there's increased divides in who is able to access these spaces and also govern these spaces. I think typically the narrative is that young people are digital natives, they've grown up in this environment, but they're often positioned as users of the technology instead of being seen as people who are also part of the governance of the technology and developing policies and holding people in positions of authority accountable for the decisions or that are made and the decisions that are not made on their behalf. And in addition, to look at elderly populations or generations who may not be familiar with these technologies and also not be able to then access services as we become increasingly digitized in various communities around the world. So how does this relate back to narratives? Well, the dominant digital narratives around technology are often ones that have been ones of exclusion, marginalization, and injustice. As I said, we frame certain groups of people as being consumers instead of being active participants or meaningful partners within these digital contexts. But we're also not asking the key question of what is being consumed. If we see this space as one of consumption, feeding into very capitalistic ways of doing things or relating, we're not, I think, pulling back the layers to take a critical lens of what is actually taking place in this type of environment. And so the question of who or what is being consumed, we're seeing increased datafication, so the extraction of people's data and commodification of people's data without their consent, without their prior knowledge, and without being able to actually take an active role in being able to decline the use of their data, or have that data deleted or corrected, especially when it's being used to inform so much of their lives and their interactions and ability to access services, to access opportunities, and the ways that they're being treated by these automated systems, including emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. There's also this idea of one-directional innovation that is in reality colonization using more palatable branding. So importing ideas into various contexts, local communities, especially within the global south, to frame it as if there isn't innovation happening on the ground in these communities, despite the lack of access to resources, despite the power differentials at play. I think that's really important for us to be mindful of this and to build our literacy capacities around power, not just in the sense of being able to read and write, but also to be able to critically analyze and engage with each other and honor the various ways that knowledge is produced and shared and assessed. So tech empowerment in particular, I find problematic. So this whole notion of empowerment, and something that I found really helpful in Josephat's presentation was talking about capacitating as opposed to empowering. Empowering in and of itself entails this differential in power, in that there is somebody who holds power, has power, and is able to then transfer it to somebody else who in this conception lacks power. But that doesn't actually, I think, really reflect the true dynamics that are at play, in that there are systems in place that restrict people from exercising their inherent agency and power. So it's really critical for us to, again, shift this language and these narratives to be more mindful of the harm that we're creating in these spaces, and really restricting the possibilities and opportunities that are available to people, and seeing themselves as being able to freely exercise their agency. Because currently, who is able to freely exercise their agency in these spaces? And what purpose do these empowerment narratives actually serve, and who do they serve in the process? Because in many cases, it's not actually serving the most marginalized communities. And so I turn to what the actual solution I have found in my practice and in the communities I've worked with, and that often really centers around collective power and action. How do we work in tandem with each other, see each other as partners, really honor each other's experiences, and come from a place of respect and empathy, both within the digital context and non-digital context. And the key, I think, for much of this is also access to information. So what does technology facilitate, and for whom? Lacking access to information endangers people's lives, reinforces inequity, and limits opportunities. We're seeing, even more recently, discussions about limiting access to platforms such as Twitter by introducing subscription models. Other platforms also pursuing similar models that restrict people's access to these spaces, especially spaces that have in various contexts become a fora for people to have discussion, or to be able to skip some of the people who have been traditionally restricting people's freedom of expression. So really trying to overcome some of those existing barriers within systems to be able to speak truth to power, hold people accountable, to express ourselves creatively, and to have that restricted in various ways, whether it's through financial models of restriction or through legal or in some cases illegal models of restriction. And again, really looking at how datification of systematically marginalized communities contributes to their dehumanization and commodification. And so I'm going to share 2 case studies with you. One is looking at tech at borders. So when we look at the experiences of displaced populations in particular, we're seeing that there's been this collection of migrants and displaced persons data without their consent and in ways that create harm. So I think the notion of digital citizenship is often seen as one that moves beyond these borders that exist in geographical or physical spaces, but in fact, we're actually seeing that it's being reinforced in digital contexts. So the tools that survey people, that try to prevent them from moving, actually then create even more barriers that are far more difficult to overcome than physical barriers in some cases, because we're seeing the securitization and militarization of borders using these very technologies to restrict the movement of systematically marginalized communities, including Indigenous persons, Black persons, racialized and gender and sexually diverse persons, disabled persons, minoritized and unhoused persons. And some of the tools that I'm referring to include drones, AI systems in immigration and asylum case determination, digital incarceration, surveillance technologies. And sometimes these very tools actually present themselves in different ways. So your social media activity, for example, can actually be used against you when you arrive at a border, where people, in particular border agents, can request access to this information. And through some of the ideas that you've shared or opinions that you've shared online can restrict your ability to enter a state, for example. In addition to this, we're also seeing how technology is being used within crisis contexts as well. So not just in movements within a nation state or across borders, but also the testing of these exploitive technologies on communities experiencing crisis, which may in and of itself be manufactured by these various systems and industries in the first place. So the particular example that I would like to highlight is the biometric surveillance system that was tested on the Afghan population by US and NATO military forces, as well as humanitarian and development actors, including UNHCR, and how those systems are now in the hands of the Taliban, who are targeting people who were affiliated with these various actors, international organizations, or military actors. And that information is being used against them either to restrict their movement, to endanger them through bodily harm or violence, or in some cases also lead to targeted killings. This is not a unique phenomenon. We've seen similar things with the sharing of Rohingya refugees biometric data with the Myanmar government, which has been targeting that particular population. We've seen how clean and green tech depends on exploitative resource extraction. So while we're being sold this grandiose idea that the climate crisis will be solved by the development of these technologies, we also need to critically think about how the very development of those technologies also may entail harms, especially in contexts where human rights violations occur with impunity and without accountability or recourse. And then again, social media platforms themselves facilitating amplifying disinformation, as we saw in the COVID-19 context, but also in sharing and amplifying racist rhetoric, fostering distrust and violence, and contributing to infodemics, genocide, and human rights violations. We've seen, for example, recently a report released by Amnesty International, which highlighted the role of social media platforms in contributing to genocidal acts within the context of Myanmar. And this is, again, not something that is seen to be unique. It's actually likely to be occurring in many other contexts as well. And there are people who are working on research, including myself, to really understand how this is taking place and how we can build more resilience and agency, both individually and collectively, to combat this. And so what do I recommend when we talk about decolonizing tech? It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think really, for me, what's important is supporting agency. So thinking about and addressing the systemic barriers, so identifying what those barriers are, instead of placing the responsibility on individuals, really understanding how certain systems have been built in place to prevent especially marginalized and targeted and excluded communities from being able to take part in governance, decision-making, policy-making, and have a say in how their lives will move forward. And I think in order to do that, we need to be moving beyond really problematic narratives around empowerment and unpack power dynamics. We can't talk about any of these issues without really unpacking the power dynamics that are at play. And in that, language really matters, whether we're talking about citizenship, whether we're talking about empowerment or disempowerment, or whether we're talking about who's telling stories. We need to be incorporating different pedagogies and philosophies that go beyond some of the what has been seen as the norm of Eurocentric white supremacist rhetoric, and decolonize our conceptions of literacy, what leadership means, what knowledge means, and what power means, and then honor traditional and indigenous knowledges in that process, but not extract those knowledges. We need to be really fostering an environment that cares for these very people who hold this knowledge and be able to facilitate their transmission from generation to generation, which has been restricted because of colonial patriarchal and hierarchical systems that have been put into place. And finally, we need to be centering justice, peace, and equity in everything that we do. We need to be asking the critical question of who is visible in the spaces that we occupy, who is made to be invisible because it is intentional, and foster those meaningful relationships while tackling disinformation, information, and work together as partners and not see technology as the solution, but as an enabling tool to be able to advance peace and justice in meaningful ways. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I feel like I've gone over a little bit, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Bushra. You're well within time. No worries.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much for that. That was really, really fascinating. I come from a rights background myself, and I used to work for Amnesty before this, and I was involved in some of that work that you mentioned, so that's really good to hear about. I'm going to ask straight away if you have any questions for each other based on your work, because I know that there are some overlaps between the two of you in terms of capacity building, in terms of context as well, and people using a digital space and existing in digital space, but in parts of the world that are often overlooked or not included in the main conversation. So I'm not sure, Josephat, if you've got any questions for Bushra or vice versa. Or else we will move to questions from the floor. We've got some questions from audiences that were listening in.
I have a question for Josephat. If you don't have a question for me, I can start.
Yes, you can go.
Sure. So a question that I have is, when you're maybe more about how you're engaging in some of these spaces, what do you find to be some of the barriers as you're sharing some of these lessons learned from your own experiences? What are the barriers that you're experiencing in the work that you're doing, both from like a local perspective, but also in how maybe the global community is engaging with you and the initiatives that you're leading?
Good question, actually. I think some of the barriers that we are currently facing locally now is in terms of, the policies and legislation in place. We don't have a lot of policies when it comes to the work that we need to do to address the issues of media and information literacy. Our access to information bill was just endorsed or passed recently, I think over a month ago or so. So that was not there in the place. We don't have the data protection laws in the country. We also don't have the cyber security strategies as a country. So some of these things are things that, all laws that needs to be in place, or that we want to be in place for us to be able to really also raise awareness on some of these issues. When it comes to the global, I think it's in terms of trying to find the right network and the right partners to engage with that aligns to the work that we do, so that then we don't work trying to reach different people's agenda, but that we are also trying to make sure that our agenda and our goals are also heard, and that we are not trying to play like who's the boss or who has more money than who and all of that. And then lastly, I think also at a global stage is in terms of synergies, really, trying to find synergies between the work that we do and how we can then be able to also make sure that what other people are doing that aligns and that speaks to our context is also then brought back to the Namibian context, so that together we can be able to empower the young people in my country.
And I've got a question for you, Josephat, as well. I've also got a question for you, Bushra. You speak about media information literacy in Namibia, but then also taking it to other countries. And I think it would be really, really useful to get a sense of, you mentioned political disinformation around election times and things like that. I'd be interested to find out what the government's approach or the government's support or lack of support is like for the initiatives that you set up, or just media and information literacy sort of efforts more generally. And I suppose a little bit about what the information environment is like in Namibia and in other countries that you've even taken this project to. Because obviously that's a very important piece of background to put your project in context.
Thank you. I was noting that down. When it comes to the local support, I think from the government-wise, they have been actually buying into the idea. Namibia, our youngest Deputy Minister of Information and Communication Technology, I think she's the youngest minister on the continent, and she has actually been very much supportive of the work that we're trying to do. And then also we have been engaging more with our UNESCO's office when it comes to media and information literacy, where they've actually really played a very important and crucial role around that. But then also when it comes to information sharing, as I've mentioned, the access to information was just recently passed. So that has actually been, one of the little bit of a loophole there, because we couldn't then at sometimes get the information that we wanted, because, you didn't have a national document or a policy document that, can be able to justify why you need specific X, Y, and Z information. But that has been coming in place. But then I think maybe another one is more in terms of the data protection law that I've just mentioned now, that there's no data protection. So yes, we have an access to information, but when you share your information, when you share your data, how protected are you? How can you be able to make sure that you stand up and that you advocate or raise awareness of your data being implicated or being stolen or being used for something else that you don't want it to be used. So yeah, I think those 2 years.
And a little bit about the information environment, like the state of information and freedom of information and things like that in Namibia?
When it comes to, the state of freedom, I think we're trying to do quite okay. I mean, Namibia has actually been praised as being, the creme de la creme on the African continent when it comes to freedom of the press. And I think we are the second one on the continent also when it comes to the, freedom of expression and all of that. So it is actually there. And I think that also plays or has been playing one of the major role, because now on the paper wise or on the continent wise, we are being seen as having this in place, having that in place, abiding by the rules and the laws and all of that. But then when it comes to really looking at it in the local context, you also try and see that, there are also some major gaps that needs to be filled, and that we should not only continue to just praise anything because, it's just been mentioned out there that we are doing good in ABC without really understanding the deeper context. Because when you look at that, you also need to ask yourself, like when we're talking about this, how many adolescents are informed, how many elderly people are informed on this information, how many people's bank account has been hacked online, what is the importance of media and information literacy to all of these people, and how does all of this also be able to contribute, or how do all of this also contribute to information sharing and media and information literacy also?
Yes, I suppose, because I do know the situation in Namibia is one of sort of to be praised more generally, but I think that raises the point that I'm about to ask Bushra. It's for digital citizenship to be something which is, I loathe to use the word empowering, but something which is giving people access to what they need, to give people access to their rights, allowing people to enjoy their rights within the digital space and in the offline space. One needs to be or create an enabling environment. And so, Bushra, then it comes to you, and I want to ask you a little bit more detail about, for those who do not exist in enabling environments, and by environments, obviously, I don't just mean geographical environments, I mean their context within society and things like that. Can you give a little bit more detail about what you mean by the sort of danger of empowerment as a term, and where capacity building becomes the important thing to look for?
Yeah, I think what ends up happening is something that I've seen, exist in terms of the dynamics within the humanitarian development sectors or contexts, where people are seen as beneficiaries of programs. So things are developed without, their consent, without really the co-creation, co-development, to be able to inform what is being created when they're supposed to be the people who are benefiting from these very programs or policies. And then you see how, for example, there's this whole narrative around, in order to address fraud within a humanitarian context, we've implemented biometric surveillance systems. When you actually look at the data, it shows that instances of fraud are quite negligible. And in fact, there's actually being harm being created by the collection of this data on especially marginalized and vulnerable communities that have been made to be vulnerable because of those very systems that are in play. And they can't meaningfully refuse the use of those systems because they're used to be facilitate access to food, shelter, all of these things are being predicated on this. And it's not just something that happens within a refugee settlement context. It's also occurring within so-called developed contexts as well. I can give examples from the Canadian context where, in order to access certain drug programs, which are the right of citizens or residents, you need to be using these online systems, but many people may not have access to, or there are language barriers and the forms that these tools are available in, and it's creating further harm for these very marginalized communities in the first place. And then there's somebody out there who's benefiting from that, whether it's authoritative regimes or corporations who are extracting that data and then reselling it. I think those dynamics are really creating further gaps in who's able to exercise their power and agency, and furthering inequality and injustice. And that, again, is being replicated in the digital environment. It's like the digital space sits on the scaffolding of the existing physical infrastructure or systems that we have in place.
And then I suppose the next obvious question is then, where does capacity building help people, or could it help people who are stuck in those environments? Because, it's almost like what I want to say is that, if we can talk about digital citizenship all we want, but while those who hold power are poor digital citizens, and they are not being responsible with data, they are not getting informed consent, they are not providing information which would allow someone to give informed consent for data usage and things like that. They are being poor digital citizens themselves. How does capacity building, or how could capacity building actually address some of that, or is there another way?
I think it's a combination. So it's both the capacity building, and that doesn't have to happen from a north to south kind of dynamic. As Josephat shared, peer-to-peer learning is really critical. Intergenerational learning within our communities, reinvesting in those very systems or processes that, because of colonization or imperialism or other systems of oppression, have been undermined. And then also really asking this critical question, which I think gets missed a lot of the time. Well, what are we doing that is actually restricting people's agency? We often don't ask that question. It's often what positive additional actions that we can take, this kind of savior mentality, but instead ask well, what are the harms that I'm complicit in or actively taking part in, and to not do those things, instead of thinking about what additional programs can I create to maybe sometimes just feel good about ourselves as people who have privilege, or who are benefiting from these systems that have been put in place and that are being actively supported. Because in order for the system to continue, including systems of harm, people need to be actively supporting them, whether that's on an individual basis or collectively as various communities. And I think when we reshift the conversation, I think it does a lot more in unpacking those power dynamics and shaping how we see certain people to have power and certain people not to have power.
I'm going to move to a question from someone who's been watching your session, because I think I'm going to add to their question a bit for you, Josephat. You've mentioned that the relevance of MIL due to the information overload post-COVID-19. Could you elaborate more about the challenges Millie faced in delivering MIL projects post-COVID-19? And to that, I'm going to ask you to also speak about something that became very apparent post-COVID-19, which is, you know, the vast inequalities that it revealed in terms of access, in terms of ability to move online when offline became restricted, and what that says and how MIL and digital citizenship capacity building addresses some of those inequalities, or helps to maybe make people aware of inequalities so that they can move towards solutions. You're muted, Jasmine.
Sorry. Yes. I think when it comes to COVID-19 and MIL, we actually saw a little bit of more challenges around that, you know, in terms of how can we be able to capacitate, how can we be able to train our young people on media and information literacy in the country. And also around that, I maybe just to move a step back is that I also did a research around, you know, COVID-19 and data protection in the country, where we found out that, you know, a lot of data were being mismanaged or were being misused in the country. We also found that, you know, a lot of misinformation and disinformation has also been taking place in the country, where violation was also taking place. And this also came as a huge challenge also into our education system, because a lot of learners couldn't really also attend online. You know, there were some situation where parents were told, you know, to teach their learners on their cell phone or on their WhatsApp, or teachers to teach, you know, their learners on their WhatsApp. But then the question also didn't just come also within having the capacity or having the abilities to be able to use a phone, but it came on the issues of accessibility. Do these learners have, you know, the smartphone devices? If they have the smartphone devices, do they have the internet connectivity? If they have the internet connectivity, do they have the skills and knowledge on how to use these devices for them to be able to acquire the skills and knowledge or the information that are being taught in the curriculum? And not only on the learners themselves, but also drawing it to the teachers based on the school curriculum or the school syllabus that you're using. How are they capacitated, or how were they taught in terms of how do I migrate this syllabus that I have into a WhatsApp communication to a learners, or where I'm teaching about 30 learners or 25 learners in school or in my classroom? How do I then capacitate all of them through a WhatsApp group, trying to focus on the syllabus also to make sure that that works? But what we did also at Millie around that was that we introduced a project called the WhatsApp training. So we were training young people on via WhatsApp, but this was also a combination of WhatsApp and Zoom meeting, as well as also Jamboard on Google, on how we can then continue to capacitate them on the importance of media and information literacy. How can they be able to train other young people online without meeting in person on media and information literacy? And then also in collaboration with Deutsche Welle Academy and 5 African countries from Francophone countries, we introduced what we call the MIL-demic, or the MIL-demic. So this was an online training also on how do we address disinformation around COVID-19 online. So we had a whole setup of curriculum. We're training it online. We created some video clips around that also, just to try and capacitate, and also to make sure that we continue on our training around media and information literacy. Maybe if you can touch your next question. I think I missed it.
Oh, I was just saying that how does the MIL capacity building help potentially identify, well, we've identified the divide. How does it potentially help address the divide, if at all?
Yeah, I think it really does address, you know, the divide, because as I've mentioned, also what we do with Millie is that, you know, we do a peer-to-peer, and then with this peer-to-peer education is that we capacitate those that we have access to, we capacitate those young people that are able to grasp the information. And what we also try to do is that we try to recruit a whole diverse of different young people, be it from marginalized communities or young people who have a language barrier and so forth, so that we can then capacitate them, and then in return they go back to their respective region and be able to capacitate other young people in their vernacular language in the simplest terms and means that those young people can be able to understand in, and then in return, then we also try to make sure that these young people also capacitate their elders, so that then it does not just become young people, but that the elderly communities are also capacitated and that they understand the simplest terms. So we are not really, or we don't really educate them to be advanced at an advanced level, but just for them to have the basic of media and information literacy, just for them to be able to understand, how do I access this information? How do I analyze this information? How do I create my own messages and my own understanding around this information? And then how do I also reflect on this information? You know, and that is where the whole components of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation comes in, because now you are reflecting on the information that you're about to act on, to make sure that it's verifiable information, to make sure that it's information that you can be able to share to the next people, and then also to be able to make sure that these are information that I am consciously aware about, and I'm now able to be able to act on this information, either to share them or not to share them.
Thanks. Which actually leads on really well to the next question, which is for Bushra, which is, how does HYLA help those who are not digital natives or those that lack the access to technology? I would love to hear more about your experience in working with marginalized communities with limited access to digital technologies or information.
Yeah, so during the start of the pandemic, myself and Dr. Beatrice Bonami, a fellow ambassador for MIL, co-founded the HYLA Alliance, which is the Health and Information Literacy Access Alliance. And one of the key reasons that we did so was because information wasn't readily available in people's languages or in formats that they could access themselves. Most of the information on COVID-19 was available in, for example, like the official UN languages, but communities around the world who didn't necessarily speak those languages were already being impacted. And so what we did was partner with various communities to get the verified information translated. I created a library, a digital library, to be able to house over 112 languages, like content in those languages on COVID-19. But then moving beyond that, recognizing that some communities just don't have access to the internet or digital tools, we also then looked at other technologies, because radio, for example, is a technology, distributing messages through there, creating information packages. My co-founder, for example, implemented an initiative in Brazil, and particularly in the Amazonia region, where she had partnered with existing civil society groups and indigenous communities so that they could create content themselves within their community context, and then accompany that verified information in like a physical format, like printed packages on sanitation protocols, things that were more localized to their context, in partnership with the communities, so they could access this information in a timely, localized, accessible manner. So it was about looking beyond that, and then also within our own like local context. Like it was this kind of train the trainer model in a way, like when you're looking at like, well, people who do have access, in my context, like younger people were more readily able to access online content, but the elderly people in my family were not able to do so. And because we were distance, like it was then became like, you call people to like explain the situation to them, or like you have to then even like teach them on the phone how to use their like smartphone devices if they had access to them, or if they were able to get access to them. And then also turning to, resources like libraries. I think there was this whole narrative around libraries becoming obsolete, but they were actually like one of the key spaces where people were able to access both digital and non-digital resources, even during the pandemic. And they've been able to like pivot themselves to be able to continue to support their respective communities and provide like a space for people to come together, even if it was socially distanced, to be able to access verifiable information. Like that is, the function of librarians, for example. That's a lot of my entry into this MIL space came at a young age from being able to engage with these people who had a really like important impact in my life and the lives of other young people around me.
Wow, you've preempted the next question again, which is, as someone actively engaged in delivering MIL to the youth community, why do you think youth inclusion is important in digital citizenship education, especially in MIL education?
I think
it's for both of you. So I'll Bushra continue, and then I'll go to Josephat afterwards.
Well, Josephat, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, since we work more with young people and our focus is on young people, why do I think that MIL is very much important? I believe that it's very much important because the world is moving into a digital space. And secondly is that, young people are mostly the more majority of the population that are exposed to all the digital equipments and to all the technological equipments. But then we need to really capacitate them. And I believe that they are the future leaders, or we young people are the future leaders of this world. So for us to become critical future leaders, ethical future leaders, transparent future leaders, we need to understand and we need to really address the information or the importance of media and information literacy, because it's only through media and information literacy that we can be able to access information, important information, not just any information. We need to start filtering information. We need to start clustering the information that we're exposing ourselves to, so that when we are addressing information, when we are addressing our stance on what we stand on specific topics, then we are talking from a factual point of view, we are talking from an analytical point of view, we are talking from a reflection point of view, and we are talking from an informed point of view. So it is only through media and information literacy that we as young people can be able to sit at that table and really talk and address issues of importance and issues that really needs to be addressed, and not just to talk about any type of information that we're exposing ourselves to, but we need to really try and address what is the issues that we are facing as young people on the continent, in the global space. How can we be able to address it? How can we be able to make sure that our voices are heard at that table? And it's only through media and information literacy that we can really be able to make an impactful meaning on that table. That is what we believe in, or what I think.
Good stuff. And Bushra, I mean, obviously, I think I don't want to speak for you, but I imagine that your answer is quite similar in terms of the work of teaching this to young people and what it means for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that I think people like Josephat are already leaders. Like, young people are leaders already. I don't think it's just about becoming a future leader. I think, yes, we can talk about what our leadership looks like in the future, in the same way that like we can talk about like people who are in positions of authority. And I like to distinguish between positions of authority and leadership, because they're not necessarily the same thing. There are people who don't demonstrate the type of leadership qualities that I would like to see in the world, that are actually helping us move towards more justice and peace, and sustainability collectively. And I think maybe why the focus on youth in some cases, I think there's probably three reasons. One, like, we're systematically marginalized and excluded from decision-making and governance fora. So that needs to be addressed, because many of these policies and programs that are being developed like directly impact us, and the longevity of the impact is going to be experienced by this very generation and future generations. The second piece is because uniquely for our generation, I think we've been exposed to an insurmountable amount of information and data that wasn't necessarily available previously. And it's because we're in this digital age, and like the transition from what like we previously experienced and like prior to the industry 4.0, as some people like to call it, whatever you want to call this like new wave that we're in. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, and then have those tools that may not have been, like the tools that we used previously may not actually be applicable anymore. And so media information literacy itself needs to be innovating, and then also paying respect and homage to those indigenous and traditional knowledges that are also being sidelined because of this, the colonization of the digital environment as well. And then the third piece is, I think, it's not just a youth thing. So I think it's across generations we need to be working together. And so that investment, I find, needs to happen in partnership. And so when we kind of tokenize young people in this space and like, again, see them as consumers rather than like collaborators and partners, we're actually doing a disservice to our global community, and really like limiting what's like possible for our collective future. Something that I find problematic, for example, is young people are often invited to share their stories. We've seen this with like the climate, crisis or climate change movements. We've seen this around issues with like refugees and migrants, and who's selected to be like a spokesperson for those experiences or tokenized. But that is not met with the actual investment in resources. So the funding isn't there. Like, how little funding actually goes to these innovative young people who are leading initiatives within their communities in partnership with other generations, it feels like a lot of it is very performative, where we're asked to come into spaces to speak about like what we're doing, but then the resources don't follow, or there's like additional hurdles, or we're not seen to be trusted enough to be leading on things, with the caveat, like, as long as we're doing things for free, that exploitation will exist. But as soon as like we maybe demand or like ask for that like equitable treatment and respect in terms of resources and space within like decision-making tables, to be co-creating, co-developing, and co-learning together, then there's all of these additional barriers that are put up for many of us. And I think that needs to be addressed intentionally.
And then just to wrap up, I mean, a great question that people obviously are very engaged with your work. Someone wants to know what new collaborations or projects do you hope to attempt in the future as an extension of your ML work for both of you. I'll start with you, Josephat.
All right. So, so for us, we've actually been engaging with different countries in the Southern Africa on MIL, and that is how we've been trying to really advance and make sure that we are taking MIL to the rest part of the world, and to also train and capacitate them in terms of our approach and how they can be able to do that. Luckily, last week we also invited 5 different countries. That was Botswana, Zambia, South Africa, and Lesotho to Namibia to celebrate the Global MIL Week. And at that specific week, we actually launched what we call the MIL Content Hub. So it's an online platform that contains all the resources and all the tools that you can be able to use free of charge on MIL. So it has video contents, it has audio contents, and there are also reading materials that you can be able to download and also use them for any other usage that you really want to use it also. So that is one of the future thing that we've also created. And we also now are working with UNESCO also in Windhoek also to really also try and make sure that we are creating another initiative where we're trying to raise awareness on MIL using both television and radio. So this is the future that we're trying to direct to and to move into. Of course, the ideas are big, the initiatives are big, the goal is big, but the goal and everything depends on resources and capacity and all of that, which might never be enough.
And Bushra?
Yeah, so I like to take a systems approach with the work that I'm doing. So I anticipate I'll likely be doing this work at a level approach. And so continuing to work with various communities, even, finding ways to partner with Josephat and like the Millie Initiative, for example. Like for me, it's really important for us to be working collectively on these issues. I'm also conducting research through like my work with UNU eGov's department on, for example, issues around digital access and rights, and taking a critical lens on this so that we're really going beyond, I think, some of the problematic systems and dynamics that we have in place. And then in addition, really starting continuing some other initiatives beyond some of the stuff that I've done with Heal Alliance, including like in gender media, which is a platform I had launched a few years ago, but really getting back into gender mainstreaming within like narratives and contexts, especially when it comes to things that like for me are very personal. Like I am a child of refugees, first generation Afghan Canadian, and what's happening in Afghanistan is deeply troubling for me. Like girls have not had access to education for over 400 days now, and it's the only place in the world that they're not able to access education based on their gender. And so it's, to me, like one of the things that's a priority, like how do we change those dynamics? Because I think some of the narratives that had existed previously, that like certain groups of people were going to come in and save like us or like our communities, that's not going to happen. We're seeing instead that like young people, for example, in Iran right now are leading movements to liberate and to like center freedom and justice and equity, including on like gender justice. Quite young people, in fact. And like, I think that's something that's really important for me to be able to amplify that and support that in meaningful ways. And then to look at like the existing systems of harm within my local context, and understand it from like this more connected to, again, the global, because they are interlinked. Things don't like get restricted within borders. Like these systems of inequity and injustice replicate themselves. And it's also, I think, our collective responsibility to be replicating systems of justice instead. So that will be my focus, I think, mobilizing resources, knowledge, and people to come together collectively on these issues. And also leading a project in particular on decolonizing some of the stuff around climate justice and the narratives that we are sharing in that space.
Thank you so much, both of you. It's fascinating to me. Like I said, I come from a rights background, and I think one of the things that is just clear from both of your work is that we can do what we can in terms of capacity building, but the reality is we also have to dismantle systems. It's not enough to just take. We have to challenge those systems from within as well, and to build capacity not just for people to fit within those systems, but to make sure that they can actually take down those systems and challenge them as well where they can. So thank you so much for your time. Let me tell people about what's happening next. And I know that I will certainly be watching both of your work, especially as it relates to my own and especially as it relates to the Southern Hemisphere, because we often aren't front and center of these conversations. Thank you very much to both of you, and to Cecilia, who had to leave us, who gave us good insight into the world of digital citizenship. Tomorrow's Concurrent Sessions number 2 will start at 3 p.m. In Seoul time, which is, I'm not quite sure what time it is in other people who are watching online, but it is 3 p.m. Seoul time. And again, it will be a session like this where people will be able to ask questions of panelists online. We've had a very, very busy day with a lot of insight, and I think tomorrow will be very rich as well. So I hope both of you will be watching tomorrow's sessions as well. Thank you so much to both of you, and thank you again to our hosts today. And yes, we are signing off for the day, and I hope very much that these discussions continue outside of the space as well. I'm quite sort of heartened by the idea that Bushra, you and Josephat might somehow find a way to work together in the future, doing as you do. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for watching and taking part in today's sessions.